I am Hanna Spielman Schrob, and I live in Dallas. I have 4 beautiful, wonderful children who have all made a good way in life. I have 5 wonderful, beautiful, great-grandchildren, and I have 4 wonderful, great-great-grandchildren. So I'm a lucky woman. I never thought that I would live to see all that. My mother was born in New York, and when she was 5 years old, her parents decided that they didn't like this New York. They weren't happy, and they picked up and they moved to Germany. My father was born in Poland, and he was an optician. And on a business trip to Germany, he met my mother. And they fell in love and were married and had their first son in Essen, Germany. And then Hitler started to come into power, and they realized that it was no longer for a Jew to live in Germany, and picked up and moved to Holland, thinking that we were all going to be safe there. Well, we had a lovely home. My father had a very lucrative business. My siblings went to school in Holland. I was not able to go to school because at that point the Germans moved in.
Without warning or the slightest provocation, they unleashed upon their innocent neighbor the full terror and fury of a devastating blitzkrieg. The force of the Luftwaffe was revealed to a shocked country. A purposeful army floated relentlessly down from the skies to penetrate hard-held lines of defense.
I was a child, so we really didn't think about what was going on. We had no idea. Except that when we heard the airplanes rolling over and the air raids and the bombings. That scared us terribly. But when it was over, we were just kids and we picked up and did what kids did. I guess we really, at my age, I think my older brother probably was more affected by it than we were at the time. It was later on in my life when I looked back and I realized, oh my gosh, what did we go through? And how did we survive? Why are we alive? Those are all questions that entered my mind after I became an adult. My aunt and uncle, who had moved into Holland with us, had made arrangements to go back to the US. And they begged my parents to join them. And my father said, I'm not leaving. I think I'm fine here. It's not going to come here. And he had this wonderful business and he just couldn't just give that up. So when things really got bad, finally my father saw the light and he made arrangements for us to be transported to the US. They crated everything for transportation, but the Germans wouldn't let the ship go out of port. And so we were stuck. That was it. And one of the neighbors, a non-Jewish neighbor, a few doors down, approached my parents and said that they would be willing to store all these crates for them, and if they should survive this war, it'll be there for them if they can come back to get it. And my father did go back, and everything that we had stored there, he had shipped to the States. So a lot of china and silver and valuables we were able to get back. And it was because of these non-Jewish people who were willing to help out. My mother was pregnant at that time with my little sister, and she went into labor in the hospital, and during that time there was an air raid, and so the nurses were all busy bringing all the patients down into a sheltered area, and forgot about my mother, and so she delivered that child all by herself. You know, I sort of think back on Anne Frank and what happened to her. She was in hiding for almost 2 years, and then somebody in the town told the Germans about these Jewish people that were hiding in this building, and they took her away, all those people that were hiding with her. That's what happened to us in Holland. The mayor squealed on us and said there are Jewish people living in that house. And why did they do that? Because they felt that that would give them safety, and that the Germans wouldn't do anything to them. It's sad that people would take that route, you know? He didn't have to do that. He could have just said, I don't know. I don't know of any Jewish people. But you never know what human nature is. And some people just looked out for their own good and not for the good of their neighbors. This was the star that all Jews were required to wear on their outer clothing. And it was sewn on your arm. So that's the way all the Germans knew who was Jewish in the town. Maybe there was a reason why my parents held on to that, just so they kept the memory alive and not to forget anything. I can't answer it really. That's how I felt about having it. That every time I look at it, I remember, oh my gosh, what we went through. 6 weeks after my sister was born, the Germans knocked on our door and said, we have to pack our things. We were allowed a suitcase each. What do you do when there's 4 children and 2 adults, 1 infant, what do you pack? And it was mainly things to survive with. Clothing, diapers, whatever would fit in to make us have some sort of comfort. I thought we were going on a trip. And here I was carrying my little suitcase. And everybody was piled into the truck. And then I guess I found out it wasn't a vacation trip at all. We're in jail. My mother spent most of the time chasing after the rats that were running around to protect us. And from there, terrible things started to happen. They then transferred us to Westerbork, which is a concentration camp in Holland. Life there was unbelievably miserable. There was no food. They were long barracks. And these bunks. And the other thing that I remember was the barrack where you went to the bathroom. No privacy. And everybody went in, looked straight ahead or down, and did what they had to do, and then just left. And it smelled awful. How does a young child remember that? I mean, you would, because it's so traumatic to see that and to be in that situation. My mother was trying to nurse the baby, but because she wasn't getting any nourishment, her milk ran out. And so now my sister's life was in danger. We didn't know if she was going to survive or not. So then, 6 months later, they transported my mother and the 4 children to a camp in Germany. It was an internment camp. Internment camps were where people with American citizenships were held to be used as a bargaining point to get German soldiers back. In other words, Americans were traded for the Germans to get their people that were captured back into Germany. My father remained in Westerbork. He never spoke to us about what he did in Westerbork. We were transported from Liebenau in Germany to France, to Vittel. And they had fenced it completely off and made it an intern camp. We were there for almost 2 years. Life was very, very difficult. We were always fighting for my sister. We knew how easily her life could be cut off. She was very malnourished. So whatever we could do to help her to survive, we did. There's a little story that I can tell that my mother had found, somebody gave her a very, very old carriage, baby carriage. And she said to me one day, "Why don't you take little Edie for a walk?" And so I walked down this street that was covered with rubble from all the bombings that had previously been in the camp. And during that walk, an air raid went off. And so I decided to run back to my mother, and the baby carriage tipped over from all that rubble. And I picked my sister up and put her in my arms and ran back with the carriage back to where my mother was. They were just about to lock the door when I came, so I made it just in time before the bombs started exploding. I can see that picture of me running up that street with my sister in my arms like it happened yesterday. There was a transport from Westerbork, where my father was, to Vittel, where we were. My mother has said when we were separated that she would never see him again. So we were watching this transport walking in towards the camp, and all of a sudden we spotted my father at the very end of the transport guiding a man who was blind. And my mother saw him and screamed and then just passed out. She could not believe what she had seen. And that's how we were reunited with my father. A miracle, because who would have thought after 2 years that we would be reunited? We had no knowledge that my father was going to be on that transport. We never thought it would ever happen. The reason we survived as we did was because of my mother's American citizenship. And she used that. I mean, my mother was a fighter. And she would go to the Gestapo and scream her head off, and "You can't do this, and I need this for my baby." And they said, get this crazy woman out of here, give her what she wants. And it sort of helped us to survive. Quite often in the camp, we were brought to this building that had a whole row of hairdressers, and all the women had a hair check. And the biggest fear was that if they found lice, they shaved you off. I had lice, and I had gorgeous long hair down to my tush. And my mother was so concerned what was going to happen to me. And she had a woman friend who was a dentist, and she said, can't you do something and help me? Do you know what we can do? Well, they did everything they could possibly do. Whatever they got their hands on, they washed my head with it. And eventually I had no lice, and I went and got examined, and I didn't get shaved. And we all cried because my parents just treasured this beautiful hair that I had. And years later, after I came to this country, and I wanted to be like all the other kids, and I wanted my braids cut off. And I had to do it without the consent of my father because he just loved those braids. That was one of the frightening incidents in that camp. But in 1944, I believe it was April, the Americans rolled in and liberated us. That was such a joyous time when we saw these trucks rolling in over all the rubble. I also remember one of the soldiers at the fence who handed me my first piece of white bread and a carrot. And I took that food and I ran back to my mother and I said, this is for Edie, because I didn't need it, she needed it. And of course it was just a small little thing, it wasn't going to bring her back to life, but we did everything that we could to try to make that happen. There was one particular soldier who had a hand puppet, and he stood by the fence and played this hand puppet to us, to all the children that were behind the fence. When we were liberated, and of course they found out we were Americans, they arranged for us to be transported back to the States on this American battleship. It was the Thomas H. Barry battleship, and it was a ship transporting all wounded soldiers. And myself and some of the other kids were allowed to go in occasionally to sit with the soldiers, and they told us stories, and we sang some songs. And it was just amazing how, with all their pain and suffering, that they would be smiling and happy to see us. And I felt, gee, even then I was able to do a little good. This ship took a long time to get us to the States because we were still trying to avoid German submarines. The war was still going on, and this was in December 1944. Let me talk about Boston, okay? We were met by the American Red Cross, and we were served donuts and hot chocolate. And to this day, donuts is one of my favorite things to have. It was such a wonderful feeling to have these people take care of us that way. And then we were put on a train to New York, where we were met by my mother's family, who had been living in the States. And we were housed in different I mean, there were 6 of us, so they couldn't put us all up in one place. So we were separated for a little while in Long Island. And then my uncles bought a house in New Jersey, in Orange, New Jersey, for us to live in. And that's when life started for us again. My sister, God bless her, when we came to this country, she was barely alive. And my father and mother took her to several doctors in New Jersey. What can we do to bring this child back? And one of the doctors, you have to remember, my parents were Orthodox Jews. One of the doctors suggested that my parents feed my sister bacon. Well, that's unheard of in an Orthodox home. But they went out and they bought a plate, a knife, and a fork, and a pan, and bacon. They covered the stove, because it wasn't kosher. And so they used those utensils to make the bacon. And afterwards, when she no longer needed the bacon, they just disposed of it. And every day they fed my sister bacon. And my sister is still alive today, living a good life in Florida. That's why I love bacon, because they wouldn't let me have it. I smelled it, and it smelled so good. And so now I have my bacon whenever I want it. When we came to this country, my parents learned how to assimilate, I would say it in that way. But my father, I don't think ever was able to get over what happened to our lives. He had a hard time providing for his family in New Jersey. We had very little as a child. I never had anything of my own until I got married. It was always hand-me-downs that I wore all through high school and grammar school. I don't think it bothered me. I was just happy to have such beautiful clothes. The events that occurred in their life just froze them, I think. And it was such a struggle to raise their 4 children, that my mother got some jobs. The first job she had, she was good at sewing. And we had an old Singer sewing machine, with the treadle. And she did piecework for Bali bras. She would make the bras and the girdles, and for the pieces that she produced, they would pay her. And eventually, she got a job at a furniture company and became quite a, she sewed the curtains for stages where 2 or 3 men had to help her push the fabric through the machine. She worked hard. And we were not allowed to tell my father that she's working, because that was unheard of for men to have their wives working. It showed that they weren't able to provide enough or whatever. It worked on their egos, I guess. But when my father needed some money for a new car, he knew where to go. He would get it from my mother. How did my mother get it? Never asked. So there were some hardships there. And I don't think they ever were able to get over it. We were able to go to school. I was put in kindergarten at the age of 9 because I didn't speak the language. And I believe I was in kindergarten for maybe a month, and then They saw that I could probably handle first grade, and I was there maybe a couple of months, and they finally got me into the right grade for my age. And that's where I experienced some of the anti-Semitism from kids in school. I was frightened because this one boy followed me going home and started cursing at me and calling me a dirty Jew and telling me to go back to where I came from. And eventually he knocked me down in the road and sat on me and started beating me up. And that's probably the most traumatic experience I had with anti-Semitism, which was very surprising to me, that I came to this country of free people, and yet I'm being told to go back to where I came from because they said, dirty Jew, go back. That was tough, and I never forgot that either. You can forgive, but you do not forget. And I think that's what many of us had to do. We never had time to talk about those things. We were too busy living. Bernie went off to college when I was still in grammar school. I got married when my sister was still in grammar school. So we never had that closeness in our years in New Jersey. I was taking the job of a private secretary to a the president of a furniture company. And the person that was leaving was training me. And sometimes in the afternoon when there was nothing to do, we talked. And she said, I have a brother-in-law I want to introduce you to. And I said, oh gosh, I just don't need another blind date. But I didn't know how to say no. And so she arranged for us to have a day at Lake Hopatcong in New Jersey. And we spent the day there, got burnt to a crisp. And on the way home, Herb said to me, would you like to go to a movie tonight? And I said, oh, I don't think I can. I'm just so burnt. I just would be very uncomfortable. So he dropped me off at home, and then he called 3 or 4 times. And about the 4th time, I said to my mom, that's Herb Schrob calling. Tell him I'm not home. And she said, go do your own dirty work. So I got on the phone. And Herb Schrob proceeds to tell me that he got tickets for a show in New York, and he made arrangements for dinner. And I thought, oh my gosh, how can I say no? He made all these plans. Well, I went, and that was it. When I really felt alive again and happy was the day I got married. I was only 21. My husband was 26. I don't know if it was infatuation or if it was love. I think love is something that develops as you live your life together to a point where you just feel like you're one. And that took time. I really didn't know what love was. My father was very arrogant, I would say. When I was a little girl and I wanted to sit on my dad's lap, he would always have a cold. You know, there was no physical touch, no kissing. I never saw my parents show any love for each other. So I really didn't know what is love. And I learned, he taught me how to love and what love is. And I still think of that from the day that I married him, what he brought to my life. Herb was working at DeVoe and Reynolds at the time and going to Newark College of Engineering to get his degree in chemical engineer. And DeVoe and Reynolds promised him that once he graduated that they would promote him to a regular position. Well, it turns out that they were anti-Semitic and they wouldn't promote anybody of the Jewish faith. And so we decided he's not going to get anywhere, so we need to find another place. And he applied to Foster Grant in Leominster, Massachusetts. And they gave him a job, and that's where he was employed until he passed away. Joe Foster asked us at one point if they were building a plant in Holland, in Breda, and asked us if he would go over there to oversee the construction or the beginning of this plastic plant. And he jumped on it. He wanted to do this so badly. I got all phone calls from family. My mother said, "Why would you want to go back there? You know what happened when we lived there." I said, "Mom, it's 25 years later. Everything is back to normal." My uncle called Herb and said, "I want to make you a millionaire if you join up with me." And my husband said, "No, we're going." And we did, and it was 4 of the best years of our life. We went with 3 children. They all went to Dutch schools, spoke fluent Dutch. My son David only spoke Dutch to me, but I always spoke English to him because I didn't want him to lose that. While we were living in Holland, Joe Foster sold part of the company to American Hoechst in Germany, which is one of the biggest pharmaceutical companies. And because my husband was in charge, he had to travel quite a few times into Germany. And one time he said, "I want you to go with me." And so we drove. And we got to the German border, and I saw the customs inspectors walking towards the car, and they had those green uniforms on. And the first reaction I had was to duck under the dashboard. I was so frightened. And my husband had to talk to me and say, "Look, there's no reason to be frightened anymore. Nothing is going to happen to us." And he calmly talked me into getting back on the seat, and they checked our passports and they said, "Go." And that was my first time back into Germany. I have to admit, Germany is a beautiful country. And we had to meet quite a few people. We befriended one couple, and they had invited us over for dinner. And they somehow, I don't know how this topic came out, that I was a survivor. And the hostess said to us, started to cry. And she said, "I am so sorry for what my father had to do. He didn't want to do that, but he had to. Just like all the Americans that were called up to go into the service, and they had to go over there, and they had to fight, and they had to kill people. So many German people, I learned, didn't want to do that, but they had no choice. It was either that or get shot." And this woman sort of helped me to see that not everybody was guilty. It was a hard thing to accept, but the more I traveled into Germany, the more at ease I felt. And then we brought my mother over for a visit, and while she was there, we learned that my uncle, who was in Bavaria, Germany, took ill, and my mother desperately wanted to see him. So we got her a ticket on the train, and she went into Germany. I was shocked that she did this. And when she came back, she said, you know, I just have to say, it's a beautiful country. And there were a lot of Jewish people. Frankfurt has a huge Jewish community now. A lot of them went back. How can you go back, knowing what happened? And they said, it happened, but this is our country. This is where we were born. This is where we were raised. And they were just going home. You know, where else do you go if that's your home? While we were there, we befriended some Jewish people in the community, and they had lost their synagogue during the war. It was bombed completely, and they had no place to gather to worship or to be together with other Jewish families. They tried to get the Jewish government the Dutch government to help them to rebuild the synagogue, but there were no funds for that. So on one of our visits back to the States, Herb and I went for a week, I think. And when I was in New Jersey, I met with our rabbi and asked him if he would know of any funds that might help these people out. And he spent about an hour on the phone calling all different foundations, and nobody had any funds for us. And then I went to Worcester, Massachusetts, and I met with my rabbi there, and it was the same story. There just aren't any funds for that. Joe Foster heard about, what is Hanna and Herb doing? And he called him into his office and said, what is this thing that you and Herb, Hanna and you are doing? And he told him about these Jewish people and that they want a synagogue. And Joe Foster said, when you go back, you tell them that they will have a completely funded synagogue. And Joe Foster was going to pay for the whole thing. And that's what we did. And they did finally rebuild a synagogue. And Herb and I were, at that point we were already back in the States, but Joe Foster asked us to go for the dedication. It was unbelievable. All the dignitaries were there, and the rabbis were there, and all the Torahs were being carried. And one of them was my husband. He had one Torah in his arms. I think that was probably one of the highlights of our life, that we were able to accomplish this. When I was an adult living in Worcester, Massachusetts, I will never forget one Halloween. We bought some candies to distribute to the kids that rang the doorbell. And a couple from down the street, we lived on a very small lane, dead-end lane, and he was a professor at Worcester Polytech, and he was escorting his children. I opened my door, and there he is standing in a Ku Klux Klan costume. And my heart just sank. I said, in this day and age, you're still doing that? It wasn't funny. You know, it was really upsetting to my husband and me. I didn't talk to them ever again. We were only about 6 or 7 homes on that street, but I never spoke to them again. And that's still existing today. It's very prominent right now. And it's so frightening because some of the things that are happening make me feel like Hitler's on his way back. It is a free country. And my husband and I had an occasion, we had the opportunity to travel to many parts in the world, and every time we came back and we landed at the airport and got off, my husband said, "I could kiss the ground I'm walking on." That is a part that's falling away from me. I was always very patriotic. I love America. But I can't feel that way today because I never thought I would see the day that things would fall apart like they are. And I have no idea what this country is going to be like after I pass away. I'm very concerned about that for my children and my grandchildren. What kind of a life are they going to have if our country continues going on the path that it's on right now? I didn't talk to my children at all when they were growing up. And I think the first time that I mentioned it or discussed it or got into it was at this Thanksgiving gathering that we had. Norfolk, Virginia produced a book called To Life of all the survivors in that area. And my story is in that book. So I brought the book with me to one of our Thanksgiving gatherings, and we were all sitting around the table, and after dinner I said that I would like to read this story. And for a moment after I finished, there was dead silence. And then I remember my granddaughter, Danielle, came over to me crying and put her arms around me and said, "Grandma, I had no idea that you went through that." And I think that's probably the very first time that they really got a detailed accounting of what happened in my life. And that is one of the reasons that I've become so involved with the Holocaust Museum. I feel there are so few of us left that we've got to get that word out and make sure that people know what that kind of person could do, the horrible things that he did, and we can't allow that to happen again. You got to stop the hate, because the hate is what really ruins people, and it just can't exist anymore. It shouldn't exist, and that's what we have now. Everybody seems to be on their hate list when we're all here as free people. And we shouldn't have this. It shouldn't be here. It's up to people today to do that. Stand up and say, that's not going to happen here.